He thought moving to the quiet countryside meant freedom, peace, and a fresh start. But the moment he stepped onto his own land, he discovered a wall he never built and a lock he never touched, closing him off from the life he worked so hard for. It wasn't just wood and steel holding him back. It was something far heavier, something written deep into the rules meant to control him. What do you do when the gate to your own dream is sealed shut, and the only key is held by those who never wanted you there in the first place? But this was only the beginning. The real fight was about to start. Anthony Ridley had worked his whole life for this dream, a stretch of open land where the mornings began with the sound of cattle lowing and the evenings ended beneath skies painted with fire and gold. At 46, with hands rough from years of labor, he had finally bought his own ranch, a place to breathe away from the noise and pressure of the city. Out here, he thought he'd find peace, a chance to live on his own terms. Neighbors waved politely, and the rolling pastures seemed to welcome him home. But beneath that quiet surface, something darker was waiting, an obstacle he never saw coming, one that would test not just his patience, but his very place in the community. He thought he had found freedom, but what he was about to face would prove how quickly it could be taken away. One morning, Anthony stepped out onto his porch, coffee in hand, and froze. Where there had once been an open road leading from his ranch to the county highway, a gleaming new fence now cut through the land. It wasn't his fence, and it wasn't even on his property line, but it boxed him in like a prison yard. Echo. The center stood a heavy gate sealed with a lock he didn't own. A sign read, "Property Access, managed by the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association." His cattle were still grazing, but now they were penned in like exhibits at a zoo, their path to water cut off by rules and metal. When Anthony demanded answers, the response was cold and calculated. Marjorie Kane, the HOA president, arrived in her spotless SUV, clipboard in hand, and told him he was non-compliant. His fence didn't meet community standards, she said. Until it was corrected, the lock would stay. Anthony's stomach tightened. He remembered the mountain of paperwork he had signed when buying the property, never realizing clauses hidden in the covenants could strip him of something so basic: freedom of movement on his own land. At first, Anthony thought it was a mistake, something that could be cleared up with reason. But soon, he realized it wasn't just about a fence. It was about control. The fines began pouring in, first $50 a day, then $100. The letters grew sharper in tone, accusing him of being a danger to community appeal. When he attended HOA meetings, the board dismissed his concerns with icy smiles, while Marjorie used her authority to silence him. Neighbors whispered support in private but avoided him in public, afraid of being her next target. The message was clear. He was being singled out. Each day, the harassment escalated. Notices piled up in his mailbox, photographs taken from the road of his ranch, water tanks, tools, even the angle of his gate, each one turned into an infraction. It was surveillance disguised as regulation, and it chipped away at him. The injustice stung deeper because it wasn't just about paperwork. Anthony was a black man in a community where power was guarded jealously, and the unspoken truth lingered. If he pushed too hard, they would find ways to push him out. Still, he refused to bend. Nights stretched long as he sat at his kitchen table, collecting every scrap of evidence: maps, photos, letters. He knew he was fighting more than a fence. He was fighting for his right to exist without someone else's key holding him hostage. And yet, the more he pushed back, the more determined Marjorie became. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was making an example out of him. Then came the breaking point. Anthony walked out one morning to find his cattle restless, clustered near the fence, their lowing urgent. The creek, their main water source, was on the other side of the locked gate. The fence didn't just block him, it cut off the herd from life-sustaining water. His animals paced, thirsty and confused, while the padlock gleamed in the sun like a taunt. He rattled it, his anger boiling, but no one came. Calls to the HOA office were met with indifference. "You have other water points," they told him. But Anthony knew those tanks would never last through a heat wave. It was no longer just about rules or money. It was about survival, his and his animals. And Marjorie had made it clear. She would rather watch him break than hand over that key. But Anthony wasn't about to break. He was about to fight back in a way she never expected. What he did next would flip the entire battle on its head and leave the whole neighborhood stunned. The day of reckoning came faster than Anthony expected. Word spread that the small half-acre lot containing the locked gate, the only legal access to his ranch, was suddenly up for sale. For Anthony, it was more than land. It was freedom. If he owned that strip, he owned the gate, and with it, the lock that had held him prisoner. But Marjorie found out too. At the next HOA meeting, whispers swirled through the packed room. Eyes darted toward him as she took the microphone, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She accused him of being defiant, of disrupting community order. She painted him as a threat, a man unwilling to adapt to their standards. Every word was calculated, every glance meant to remind him, "You don't belong here." Anthony stood, folder in hand, heart pounding. His whole body shook, not from fear, but from fury held too long. He laid the documents on the table, the offer already accepted, the sale already underway. Gasps filled the room. Marjorie's smile faltered for the first time. "This gate," Anthony said, his voice steady but trembling with emotion, "is no longer yours to hold over me. The lock you used to trap me, it now belongs to me." The room fell silent. For months, they had watched him suffer under rules that bent only one way. Now, the very weapon meant to break him had become his shield. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some looking at him with new respect, others avoiding his gaze entirely, and Marjorie, her face flushed with rage, could do nothing. Legally, the gate was his. For the first time since moving there, Anthony felt the air lift from his chest. He hadn't just survived her power play, he had beaten it. But victory came with a price. Because while he had the key, the question lingered. What would Marjorie do now that her control had slipped through her fingers? The answer would shake the community in ways no one expected. He walked away that night with his body intact, but his spirit carried scars no one could see. Every time he looked in the mirror, he remembered the voices, the threats, the way his dignity was stripped from him in plain sight. The world kept moving, but for him, time had split into two parts, before that moment and after. And yet, as heavy as the weight felt, he knew this wasn't just about him. His story was one of millions, echoing across generations. It was the same silence his grandparents carried, the same fear his parents tried to protect him from, and now it was his burden too. That's the cruel truth about racism. It doesn't just bruise the skin, it bruises the soul, and those bruises get passed down like unwanted inheritance. But something shifted that night. The pain became fuel. He realized silence was no longer survival, it was surrender. So he spoke. He told his story. He refused to let it be buried under the noise of denial and indifference. And in sharing it, he found others who carried the same wounds. Together, their voices grew louder than their fear. That's the real impact. Not the humiliation they tried to force on him, but the strength he chose to create from it. Because every story told becomes a mirror the world can't look away from. So here's the question that lingers. How many more lives have to carry this same weight before we decide to break the cycle? How many more names, more stories, more nights like his before the world finally says enough? Because racism doesn't end when the moment passes. It ends when we refuse to let it repeat.